Communities across the country are battling with water issues. Johannesburg and Tshwane taps are running dry. Load shedding, aging infrastructure, the heat and high consumption are being blamed. Now let's discuss this further. We're now joined via Zoom by Professor Anthony Turton of the Centre for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. You know, water remains a scarce commodity in the country. We know this. You know, the Western Cape was edging dangerously close to day zero a few years ago. Now Gauteng faces severe water challenges. Do you think Gauteng will also end up with a day zero kind of scenario?
Yes, good afternoon to you and the listeners. It's very important not to confuse water scarcity with infrastructure failure. At the moment, we have a situation where the Vaal River system is as close to 100% as one can get. It certainly is a very full system at the moment. So we cannot say that there's a water scarcity in the Gauteng area, but we do know that the water's not getting through the very complicated value chain from taking the water out of the river to processing it into drinking water and then pumping it up into the different municipalities and filling up the reservoirs and then distributing it through tens of thousands of kilometers of piping. That's a distribution problem, not a water scarcity problem. But yes, without any question of doubt, we're starting to see failures across the country, not only in Johannesburg, Gauteng, but in other parts of the country as well. We're seeing really serious, catastrophic failures of the water supply system and also the sewage wastewater treatment system.
So let's talk about it then. You know, what is at the heart of it? What are the root causes of the water challenges that, you know, we are experiencing, as you say, across the country? You know, load shedding is a byproduct, but surely there are other more endemic reasons. Just talk us through it. We know also that infrastructure has for several years also been one of those that have been pegged at it.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So you find a situation whereby your municipalities have been restructured and there's skilled people have been purged out of the management decision-making chain over a period of time now. And we just see at the moment the current political turmoil in Johannesburg at leadership level. And how can you have a situation where there's squabbling over who the mayor is going to be, and yet underneath that you've now got technical departments that are responsible for long-term planning, but there's no stability at the top level. And we have a very strange situation in the Gauteng area whereby the population has been growing something like 20% per decade over the last couple of decades. And there's been no infrastructure upgrade, at least for the last 2, maybe 3 decades. No infrastructure upgrade at all. So 20% population growth per decade, and there's nothing that's happened on the structural side in terms of the long-term planning. We're still relying on the same pumps, the same pipes, the same water storage facilities. And of course, as your population grows and as your storage doesn't keep track with it, you start running out of what is known as buffer capacity, which means then that when you have a failure, you have a catastrophic failure because you don't have buffering within the system. You don't have what is known in engineering terms as redundancy of supply.
So we've spoken about infrastructure. You know, Tshwane, being interviewed by one of my colleagues earlier on, seems to be putting the blame squarely on excessive usage of water. But power outages have also been raised as a concern. And we know, of course, you know, I know you mentioned briefly, you know, infrastructure, but water leaks also seeming to be one of those endemic issues.
Yes, it seems to be a situation whereby a weak and incompetent leadership will always deflect the blame onto the consumer. There's just been documents published this last week, in fact, that showed that South African consumption is less than 200 litres per person per day. So in other words, we are way below what the public is being blamed for, where it is being said that we are, you know, out of line with international standards. That is not true at all. And I would say that what you're starting to see is manifestation of the fact that you have a party in power, but not in control. The difference between being in power and being in control is the kind of thing you're seeing now. We're seeing it in Eskom. We're seeing exactly the same thing. You can look at the Eskom thing back to back with the water thing, and everyone's blaming everybody else except looking at themselves in the mirror. This is completely a failure of planning. It's a failure of the management structures within the different local authorities over the last 2 decades. It's as simple as that. You can slice and dice it as much as you want to. That's what the problem is. The lack of technically competent people that's exacerbated by the weak political leadership, that is exacerbated by the squabbling and infighting at mayoral level. It's exacerbated by the failure of Eskom. All of these are exacerbating factors. But the underlying core factor is the fact that technical skills have been purged from the system over a period of time for transformation-related objectives, and you now have hollowed out organizations, hollowed out institutions that lack the technical capacity, and they've now been staffed with people that are technically incompetent and are untouchable. You cannot move those people out. They're in positions of great authority, but they do not actually have the technical insight. So we have a situation where we have a party in power, but not in control. And this is what you're going to start seeing more and more in the future. Power and control is going to constantly now start to diverge. And as it diverges, you're going to see more and more blame being put on the consumer. And the consumer has absolutely no way of fixing this problem up other than changing the political leadership.
I don't want to jump immediately into solutions mode, but when you hear, people putting pressure on mayors, as an example, to start fixing this problem, which, as you also say, is a collective. It needs much more than just one solution. So what will then, what will need to happen for us as a country to really deal with the water crisis effectively? I know you spoke about the shortage of skill as well as political will, or the lack thereof.
Yes, I'll draw your attention to the Ugu District Municipality in KZN, where there's recently been 2 deaths of 2 senior persons. One of them was the municipal manager. I had a meeting with the municipal manager late last year, and he told me then that they wanted him out of the system because they were blaming him. They were putting public blame on him for the failure of the infrastructure. Well, he's now dead as a result of some mysterious illness that he picked up. So we are getting the situation where literally it's starting to become a life and death thing now. But what we're starting to see happening is that the individual person can really do very little about infrastructure failure. But if we think of it abstractly, a large number of people are starting to live in clusters now, in body corporates, etc. So the body corporate is becoming effectively the interface between the public and this failed infrastructure. And I've been working with body corporates now for at least over a decade to try and help them to understand this new role of theirs. And most of them are quite reluctant. They don't want to accept that responsibility. But as your municipalities are failing across the country, the body corporates are now becoming the de facto suppliers of services. And whether they choose to accept that responsibility or not, that's another matter. But entities or people that live outside of your body corporate structures are, of course, left very much to their own devices. And this is where the tragedy lies, because ultimately we have to be able to cooperate in order to solve the problem. And I think the take-home message here is that as we face this divergence that I'm talking about now between being in power and being in control, that divergence is increasingly going to become a factor now as Eskom starts to collapse and as your water and other infrastructure collapse in an accelerating rate. And at that point in time, the society's ability to cooperate rather than squabble, instead of squabbling and pointing fingers of blame at everybody else, our ability to cooperate, that's the important thing. So you've got your political leadership now, your responsible political parties, they have to start rising to the occasion, have to start creating some messaging around which people can coalesce in a solution-thinking kind of way. Because at the moment, this deflection of blame and pointing fingers is not helpful in any way, shape or form. We are not going to solve this problem until we learn how to cooperate.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your time. That's where we have to leave it for this afternoon. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Of course, Professor Anthony Turton there from the Centre for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State.